Living Power with Dan Hurst.
We're in John chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, he did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you've kept the good wine until now." This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now I want you to understand what's going on here, and then we'll get into the application of it. There are, as I mentioned, several miracles mentioned in the Gospel of John, and John seems to key in on basically 10 of them, and he does so to point out some specific truth about Jesus. So each miracle is unique in that it highlights something about Jesus and about his life and about really what it is that God wants us to see about him. Now remember John's reason for writing the Gospel of John. It's in John chapter 20, verse 31. "These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ," that's the Messiah, "the Son of God," that means God, "and that by believing you may have life in his name." That's the whole reason that John writes his Gospel. That's the whole reason why he introduces these miracles. So as we study these miracles, it's important for us to really get a handle on what these miracles mean. What is it that John wants us to see about each specific miracle and the application for our life? Now, I want you to take a look. I'm going to give you a real quick list to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be doing for the next 3 years as we look at these miracles. And there are 10, there are more than 10, but there are 10 basic miracles that John seems to highlight in his gospel. First one is the one we're going to look at today, is the water changed into wine. And that is the miracle of his revelation. That's where Jesus reveals who he is, what he's all about. The second miracle is the healing of a nobleman's son, which is the miracle of his authority, reveals his authority. The third one is the healing of a crippled man, which is the miracle of his deity. It shows that he is God. The fourth one is the feeding of the multitude, the 5,000 men plus women and children, so there's probably around 20,000. But the feeding of the multitude, which was the miracle of his creation. Then the fifth one is the walking on the water, which is the miracle of his dominion over nature. The sixth one is the healing of the man that was born blind, which is a picture of the miracle of his compassion. The seventh one is the resurrection of Lazarus, which is the miracle of his power over death. The eighth one is the death on the cross. Now, we don't normally think of that as a miracle, but it is a miracle. It is the miracle of redemption. Then the ninth one is the resurrection of Jesus, which is the miracle of his lordship. And then there's one more miracle that we generally don't talk about, we miss, and we will get to in 2017. And that is the miraculous catch of fish, which happened after the resurrection. And that is the miracle of his provision. Very important miracle, by the way, when we finally get to it. It's an important miracle because it talks about and it reveals what God is doing after his ministry on earth. That he's providing, he's meeting needs. That's what he does. So it'll be an interesting miracle to study. Now, let's take a look at this first miracle. We have no idea who the bride and groom are in this wedding celebration, but considering that Mary seemed to have some say in how things were run, and the fact that Jesus and his disciples were invited, it indicates the probability that it was either a relative or a very, very close friend. Mary would not have had the right to go in and tell the servants to do what Jesus tells them to do, and and to kind of take charge there, unless it was a relative or a very close family friend of some sort. So apparently it was somebody that they knew very, very well, and that's why they were there. It would have been a horrible, horrible social blunder in that culture to run out of wine. It would have been a terrible embarrassment. And even in some circumstances, there would have been legal action for a failure to provide the appropriate care for the guest. Now, we look at that and we go, what? Why would they do that? But in that culture, they could have taken legal action. And part of it stems from the fact that they would give sometimes very elaborate wedding gifts. And if you went to a wedding and you gave an elaborate wedding gift and then there wasn't anything there for you to enjoy and celebrate and everything, they'd sue you. I mean, that's just kind of the way it was, and that was kind of that culture mentality. Now, given the surrounding experiences of the previous week in Jesus' life, now remember, we've studied over the past few weeks what was going on in that 1 week leading up to this day. Given all of the surrounding experiences that had happened during that week, it's not inconceivable that Mary understood that Jesus' ministry was beginning. Remember, their ministry as would start when you were 30 years old. If you were in the ministry, as it were, after having gone to school or seminary or whatever you want to call it, and they often refer to it, the school at the Essenes, as the school of the prophets. You started your ministry at the age of 30. And so he's 30 years old. He's drawn some disciples to himself based on the circumstances of his birth. Now, this is what Mary has got to be seeing all of this. Based on the circumstances of his birth that she remembers, the shepherds and the magi, the appearance of the angel, the words of Simeon and Anna when they took Jesus to be dedicated, Jesus' experience in the temple when he was 12 years old. Based on all of those things that Mary remembers, she has reason to know that Jesus is the Messiah and that his public ministry is beginning. So it would not have been inconceivable for Mary to understand, or at least have some concept of what was going on at that time. And Jesus' response to her has been a subject of discussion and debate for centuries. She realizes that they've got an issue here. They're out of wine, which would have been a horrible and embarrassing social faux pas. And so she asks Jesus to do something about it. Now, she doesn't tell him what to do about it. She just says, here's the problem. I don't know if she was saying do a miracle or if she was saying run down to the store and get some. But she was saying, we got a problem. You need to do something about it. And Jesus' response, when you look at his response, when you just read it, it just sounds so harsh. Jesus says, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. And it's like, was he rebuking her, or was he just being mean? What was that all about? Actually, what Jesus said to her was, and this is the literal translation. This is the actual wording of what Jesus said. When you look in the Greek, what he says is, "What to me and to you." That's the actual wording. What to me and to you. What to me and to you was an actual saying of that time. We would look at it and today, and it would be something similar to like, what's it to me? That sort of thing. But it actually went beyond that. It was something that they said. It was a phrase, almost a colloquialism of that time. And it would be used to say something like, what have I done to you that you should do this to me? Or sometimes it would be something like, that's your business, how does it involve me? That's how that phrase was used a lot of times. It was this idea of, and they would say that, what to me and to you? That was the literal thing that Jesus says to Mary. However, in this particular case, he adds the word gunai, or guni, depending on how you pronounce it and what side of the road you're from. And that is the word, and it's a generic word for woman. And so he says this, and he doesn't call her mother. He says gunai. He calls her this generic term for woman. Now, why? Some have suggested that it was a rebuke for putting Jesus in that awkward moment, but that's really, really doubtful. Remember, Jesus was the oldest child. and therefore responsible for the welfare of his mother. Probably Joseph was out of the picture at this point. Joseph had probably died. And otherwise, she would have probably said something to Joseph. She was just going to tell Joseph what to do. But he was not there, and Jesus is there, so she tells Jesus, what the situation is, and that would have been the way it was handled in that culture. And he was responsible for the welfare of his mother, and as such, they were probably very, very close. But things were about to change. Jesus knew that, and Mary apparently had some sense of that also. So this phrase, "what to me and to you," was most likely a statement that meant, this is going to affect you and me. What to me and to you is a phrase that he used to say, do you know what this is going to do? This is going to change things. This is going to affect you and me. In other words, it was a personal declaration to Mary that this would signal the beginning of his ministry and that things would never be the same again for them. Now, if that's what it meant, and I think that's what it means, then Mary's response is very telling. Because Mary's response is, do whatever he tells you. If Jesus was saying to Mary, and I think he was, do you understand that this means things are going to be different? What to me and to you means things are going to be very, very different from now on. And do you understand that? My hour isn't yet come. What he was saying is it's almost here. My hour is not quite here. It's almost here. My time is almost here. Do you understand that this changes things? And Mary's response is, do whatever he tells you. And in essence, what she was saying was she was making that commitment on her part that whatever God's will was, she was on board. So that wasn't so much a declaration to tell the servants, you guys go do whatever he tells you to do because he's Jesus. It wasn't that at all. It was a response to Jesus to say, Jesus, whatever happens, I'm ready. I'm on board. Do whatever he tells you to do to the servants, because she knew that that meant things were about to change, and she was on board with it. It's a priceless little interchange between Mary and Jesus. This recognition that now things are about to change forever. Now, who was the recipient of this miracle? Well, of course, the wedding guests were the beneficiaries of the miracle, but they didn't know a miracle had happened. When you read the story, you realize the people who got the wine had no idea where it came from. They didn't know what was going on. And in fact, as far as we can tell, the only ones who knew what had happened were Mary, the disciples, because obviously they wrote about it, and the servants. I love the fact that Jesus' first miracle was a quiet miracle. It fascinates me. In other words, it wasn't this grandiose public spectacle. Jesus didn't walk out in front of all of the wedding guests and just, wave his hands over the pots of water and they turned into wine. It wasn't that sort of thing at all. It was very quietly done. And in fact, only a handful of people knew what had happened. I think it's even more impressive that his first miracle was made known not to the religious leaders to announce that he was there and that he was God and he had this authority over nature. It wasn't that. It wasn't in front of the highly educated to convince them, of anything. It was to the servants. It's just how God does things. Don't you realize how, when you look at what Jesus did and the miracles that he did so many times, over and over and over again, it was for the common folk. It was just for you and me. It wasn't to make a grandiose statement about who I am, but rather to meet a need and to do something in somebody's life. And it was those quiet miracles that seemed to be so incredibly powerful. Only a few people knew about this one. And certainly, usually when God does miracles, there are times when just a handful of people know about it. In fact, there are times, I think, when God does miracles that nobody knows about it. Jesus' first miracle was an incredibly powerful statement of who he was, but it was only for a handful of people to understand and to get. One of the cool things about Jesus' first miracles, and this is one of the things that I love. By the way, this is one of This is one of the things that really attracted me to Christianity when I began to understand this about Jesus. Jesus' first miracle completely shattered tradition. I love that. And so do you bunch of radicals. Jesus just completely broke with tradition. I mean, he shattered the tradition of the time. You see, these stone jars are very, very important. They were used for these purification rites. And sometimes they were very, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, they would come and they would take the water and before they would eat, and they would have this purification rite ceremony, and they would dip their waters in the hand, they would hold their hands up and the water would run off, and it was very big and grandiose about how clean they were and how pure they were. And there would be prayers and, it was just a purification rite that they would go through. And it was a tradition. And it was just something that was really, really important. And the fact that there were 6 of those stone pots there indicated that the people in the house were very much into that sort of thing. And each jar was a pretty good-sized jar, 20 to 30 gallons. So it meant that there was probably up to 180 gallons worth of pottery there. And they were probably outside the house, more than likely. And the master of the banquet would probably not have known that he was drinking wine from those purification jars, because that would have been such a violation of protocol. I mean, you just don't. That's what? You took those things and you put wine in them? That's so offensive. I love that. I think that's great. We need more of that. We need to break some traditions in the church. By the way, next Sunday's study is called Messing Up the Church. I'm pretty excited about it. So Jesus comes along and he completely, radically breaks tradition, something that would have been so offensive to the Pharisees and Sadducees. They would have just been beside themselves. They would have wet themselves. They were so upset. And I don't know if you could say that, but I did. And it was that important to them. And Jesus just said, I don't care, where else are you going to put the wine? Anybody, they didn't have little wine glasses back then. They had these stone pots, 100 and up to 180 gallons of wine Jesus made, just like that. It should not be lost on us that by converting the water in these pots to wine, that Jesus violated a very serious tradition. And in doing so, what he was saying was, the old order is out and the new way is here. I think that's very important for us to understand, that when Jesus decides to act in our lives, he doesn't do it the way we think he should do it. And he breaks our traditions. He violates our traditions. There are times that God does things that violates the things that we think should happen. And there are times that God will do some things in a church and in his people that we just think is, how can that be? That's so wrong. Why is it wrong? Because it's our tradition. It becomes our ritual. And because it's our ritual, it's so incredibly important to us. And we just think, and God breaks that. He breaks and violates that tradition in our lives sometimes. The very first miracle, Jesus breaks tradition. When God begins to do a work in your life, he's going to break tradition. He's going to violate some of those things that you thought were so incredibly important and sanctimonious. And he's going to break those and shatter those in your lives, and you're going to realize maybe that wasn't that important. Maybe it wasn't that big of a deal. Because what God does is far more important than what you do. Nor should we miss, by the way, the quality of the quality factor, I call it. It was interesting that the master of the banquet just went on about how great this wine was. He just went on and on and on. He said, wow, normally people bring the good stuff, and then they start with that, and then they give you the poor stuff because you've already been drinking for a while and you don't care, and so forth. But you bring the good stuff in at the end. Wow, this is amazing. What's amazing to me was that these guys recognized that it was better than what they had been drinking. And there was something about it. It was so incredibly good to them. They were stunned by the quality of something that Jesus had done, and they didn't even know it. They didn't know that Jesus had done this. And so it's important for us to understand this and not miss the parallel of what it's saying. The parallel of high quality of life enjoyed by all those who have Jesus as Lord of their life. Don't miss that parallel. Don't miss drawing that conclusion from that. The late Leon Morris, who was a Bible scholar from Australia, made a fascinating statement one time about this very thing. He said, when Jesus changed the water from water to wine, Jesus changed the water of Judaism into the wine of Christianity and the water of the law into the wine of the gospel. That is exactly what happened in that first miracle. Jesus took something that was so common, but it was important to them, shattered their tradition, and met a need in their life, and did something that most of them didn't even understand that he had done. It didn't make sense to them, and they probably would not have even drank the wine if they had known what Jesus had done. Because they would have been so pompous about you did the stone pots, oh, I can't believe you used the stone pots, and they would have missed out on the miracle.